All right, good afternoon, everybody. Once again, thanks for joining us for today's latest and possibly greatest edition of the hashtag Slinkythink sessions. My name is Drew Kinchis. I'm the creative director with Be Life. I'll explain a little bit more about what we do in just a little bit. But the reason why you all are here today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about, as the title of the webinar suggests, embracing humanity in a digital world. I have been, I don't want to say a veteran, that might be a strong term, but I have been working in remote environments for several years. And I've also been formerly the manager of a co-working space here in Indianapolis. And so I've seen a lot of the supposed quote unquote benefits that remote workers get really excited about. But there are lots of challenges that come with being a remote employee. And if there's one big takeaway that you remember from today's session, I hope there's a few, but remember that even if one member of your team is working remotely, that the entire team is remote. So don't forget that. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. I asked a question via the webinar chat for all of you. And I'm just curious, how many of you are using Agile in your workplace right now? So if you can just respond with a simple yes, we are using Agile, or to what degree you're using Agile. Or if you have no idea what Agile is, just go ahead and say no, not a big deal. Just checking to see. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a mix. Some yes, some no. Looks like mostly yes. So the reason I ask is because we're going to be talking about in this session a lot about what being Agile means in terms of empowering a remote work environment. And there are a lot of individuals I talked to at co-working spaces that I work at, and just working in companies in general, who claim to be Agile-ish is the term I like to use. These are teams that maybe just use a daily stand-up and that's it. Or maybe they have a weekly or bi-weekly retrospective after their sprints. And it's great to be adapting some portions of agility, but our goal as an organization, Be Light's goal, is to really empower entire organizations to be agile, which is sometimes can be a daunting task. But what I love about agility is the transparency, the trust, the vulnerability that comes with having work be so visual and letting teams and individuals be empowered to make decisions to move organizations forward. So we will get more into that as the session goes on, but thank you all for responding via the chat. I got onto a tangent for a second there. Let's get back to housekeeping real quick. I'm going to be asking you all a few questions throughout the webinar via chat. As you all can see, you're not able to see me and I can't see you. So if you're enjoying your lunch, that's totally fine. I can't hear you either. So we'll just be interacting via chat. This webinar will conclude just a little bit before 1 o'clock. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Also, you will receive a video replay of this webinar right after the session is done as well for your reference. So let's get started. So a quick introduction of Be Life. So the word life means agile. So Be Life is essentially just a sentence, right? Be agile. And the big goal for Be Life is we are helping teams and individuals be the best they can be. And we do this through agile methodologies. Not to go into a long tangent, but really the goal for us is to fuel organizational agile transformations and start with individuals first, because I'm sure all of you who are using Agile at one point were using traditional waterfall management. And the transformation into Agile does not happen overnight, and it has to start with buy-in from those individuals first. So that's why we have created webinars such as this, because we want to really help empower people. And it's not just getting organizations started with Agile. It's not just helping people get certifications within the Agile space, but we really get excited about helping individuals throughout their journey, whatever that may be. And so I like to dive into what I call the squishy stuff, which is emotions. We all as human beings have a variety of emotions that all happen to us on a daily basis at different times. And so frameworks are great, but we have to be able to embrace each other as human beings and figure out what makes each other really tick to help our teams truly thrive. So as I mentioned before, transparency is obviously a big part of what makes Scrum work and all these different Agile methodologies. But you'll notice at the top of the screen, there's this little hashtag called #Slinkythink. Our logo is a Slinky defining Agile, but I love the idea of Slinkythink because when we got started, it was just Chris and I using that phrase, just be life as an organization. And now we've extended it to our colleagues, our friends, and our community partners who are also using Agile. And so Slinkythink is turning into more of a community movement, which is really fun. So if you have any strong takeaways from today's session, find us on social media. I'd love for you to go to Be Life LLC on social media. And if you just type in a quick takeaway and put #Slinkythink, that would be fantastic. The team, Chris is our managing director. He's been leading Agile transformations for almost 10 years now. So he's got a lot of experience. I think many of you probably already know Chris. And then yours truly, I am the marketing and creative director at Be Life. So why are we all here today? Let's hop into it. So this is something I'm incredibly passionate about because I'm very big into embracing vulnerability within any workplace, and especially within remote teams, which is even harder to do than in a typical physical work environment. So today we're going to be gaining insight into important strategies of how to develop a proactive mindset when fostering the growth of remote team members. I'm going to spill the beans a little bit here. A lot of the strategies that I'm going to be talking about during this webinar are not only applicable to remote teams, but they can be used in any work environment. But what I find is with remote teams, you have to be a little bit more creative with how you implement this. If it's someone's birthday and you say, hey, let's grab a cake and bring it in and sing happy birthday, that's much easier to do in a physical environment versus a remote environment. So I'm not going to come up with a strategy for you to figure out how to get a cake delivered to someone who works remotely. Jokes aside, we're going to talk about some ways that we can foster that emotional intelligence amongst the entire team. So first, we're going to talk about communication. How do we create an environment where open, honest feedback is the norm? Second, we're going to talk about support. We're going to talk about how agility fosters the mindsets that are going to empower our best teams. Third, we're going to talk about incentives. And I put question mark / exclamation point because incentives are an interesting conversation to have because companies often use blanket incentives for all their employees, but we all are inspired to do our work based on different reasons. We all have different intrinsic motivators. So to use those blanket incentives doesn't quite work across the board. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit. And then lastly, if you have any questions, I love this line. You may leave this workshop with more questions than answers, but that is okay. Chris and I would never claim to have all the answers for all of your questions or in general. So we hope that this really instigates some interesting thoughts for you moving forward to help empower your teams. So the first thing I like to do, I love great icebreakers. And today's icebreaker, we're not going to talk about work. If you've been to one of my webinars before, you know that I don't like having an icebreaker that is something simple like, what do you do for a living or what's your title? I want to dig a little bit deeper. So for today's icebreaker, I want you to share what's your favorite holiday and why. and you don't have to write a big paragraph. So Daniel said Thanksgiving is his favorite holiday because of food, family, and gratitude. That's really great. I like that a lot. Halloween, because life is scary. Great answer. Christmas, spending time with family. Thanksgiving, that's great. So my favorite holiday, boy, that's an interesting question. I would probably have to say St. Patrick's Day because I'm not really into the typical festivities, but my birthday is a couple weeks after. So it always reminds me that, oh yeah, my birthday's coming up, which is fun. So the reason your answers are really telling to me, and I love this because I asked this question because I want to know a little bit more about you, and you all put family as part of your response to why your favorite holiday is what it is. And so that tells me that you really value your family and you have an emphasis on supporting your family. And so this gives me a great foundation to continue to talk to you and say, oh, tell me more about your family. How many kids do you have? Do you have any pets? So on and so forth. I can't handle the question, how are you? Because if you ask a question like, how are you? Guess what? Vague questions equal vague answers. So I do this with a lot of my webinars where I hop into this icebreaker that's a little bit different than a typical, what I would consider to be an icebreaker. But this is really important, especially with what we're talking about today, because if we're going to build this emotional ownership within our remote teams, we've got to really dig in deeper and know what these intrinsic motivators are of the people that we work with. And it's not just within the workplace, but outside of the workplace as well. Once again, if you ask someone, how are you? The answer is going to be, I'm fine. Oh, things are good. It's really hard to take the next step in that conversation when it's just such a broad answer. So try this out next time. You know, when you're maybe introducing someone new to the team, or think about it this way. If it's Monday at 9 a.m. and you're running into all your coworkers, you don't usually ask, how are you? It's usually, how was your weekend? And you get much more succinct responses based on that because people dive into, oh, I did this, so on and so forth. So consider that moving forward to try to remove the how are you question out of your lexicon and just think a little bit more about questions that dive in to a greater degree. So that's a small bit of advice, but I think it's really powerful. So really quickly, I have two questions for you. One is, I would like for you to, oh, and I forgot to mention this too, by the way. I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So we do have a section which is called Q&A. So if you all have a question that you'd like to ask, feel free to just drop it in the Q&A and I will try to get to them as soon as I can. But at the very least, I will get to your questions at the end of the webinar. So if you do think of something and say, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, just drop it into the Q&A section and I'll get to those as soon as I can. So let's go back to the chat function. First question I have for you is, are you in a remote team? So type yes or no. Are you working remotely yourself or do you have remote employees? Please type yes or no. Okay, so we have a little bit of a mix across the board. Some yes, some no. So since not everyone is in a remote team, I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit. And I'm not going to ask you what frustrates you the most about work, because we could be here forever if we spilled the beans on things that frustrate us about work. But let me rephrase this question and ask, what frustrates you about not having close proximity to the ones you work with, not having access to the people that you work with? So take a second to just jot down maybe a sentence or two in the chat. And I'd like to hear from you all. What frustrates you the most about not having close proximity to other coworkers, not having access to people that you need to have physical access to. Okay, so Daniel mentions that it's hard to create camaraderie and collaboration. Jeff says he actually would probably enjoy it. And yes, no matter how many frustrations I hear from remote workers, I would say the vast majority of remote workers I know really like being remote, but there are some challenges that come with it. Time zone challenges, that's a huge one. If you've got teams, some people are in Pacific time, some people are in Eastern, and then if you have international teams, just getting people on the same page with meetings can be a huge challenge. My brother works for Salesforce, and he has a supervisor who's all the way in Australia, whose wife is about to give birth. So it's incredibly hard for them to even touch base based on time zones and other factors. And Heather puts, it takes longer to get to know them. That's another really, really, really great point. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, how we can foster some more of these quote unquote water cooler conversations in a remote setting. Yeah, and Jeff, the last one I'll mention here, he put hard to see emotions. Now this webinar is slides only because we want to allow you all to eat lunch and if you are working on something, just to be able to listen and dive into what's going on. But I'll talk about why, if you can use video as much as humanly possible when you're having meetings and having one-on-ones, it's super crucial to gain the nonverbal communication that's being conveyed from your teammates. Section 1, communication, bridging the gap of connectivity. So thank you all for your responses in the chat. I really appreciate it. It helps me steer the conversation to where I want it to go. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is communication. And I'd like you to write one sentence in the chat of a struggle you're having with communication within your team or your organization. So Jeff, once again, hard to see emotions. We have to, Jeff's comments are quite epic during these webinars. I will give him a shout out for that. He says we have to spiel better. In other words, we have to, when you're speaking, you don't have to spell at the same time, right? Daniel, keeping track of progress. Heather, some people do not talk much at all during meetings via Skype. That's another great point. Many people stay quiet. Yep. All right, so I want to start off with this really, really great quote. And this is a program that we deliver. It's created by the Collaboration Superpowers, a group based out of Europe. And Management 3.0 is, well, the main concept is this, which is on the screen, that it's important to manage the process when you're trying to develop the emotional ownership of a team, not the people themselves. So micromanagement is the result of managing the process and the person, and that you give them a set of tasks to do or a set of procedures or whatever phrase you want to use, and you're also telling them exactly how they have to do it. You're giving them the what and the how, and if they even stray anywhere from those two things that are very rigid, and those micromanagers aren't too happy about that. So that's not great communication. And the theme that we're going to hear throughout this webinar is talking about process-driven strategies, not people-centered strategies. And what I mean by that is create these frameworks where people can be themselves, create the environment where individuals can truly be individuals. It's really important. So to start things off, team agreements is what I'd like to talk about first. So the team agreement, ooh, my slide is zooming in. This is fun. That was an exciting little thing that just happened there. So how do we create a team agreement? So give me 1 second here. Sorry, a little technical. Must have added an animation to that slide. So I'll just hop there, and as we zoom in, I'll just keep going back. So a team agreement, if you haven't heard of it before, is an agreement that the whole team comes together on, and it doesn't define what everyone is doing, but how everyone should be working together. So it's a lot of these intangibles that frustrate us, but we don't say out loud. So the reason why this is really important for remote teams is that, yes, we all know we should be at certain meetings, and we all are usually aware of deadlines and the what of our jobs, but there's a lot of these intangibles that we overlook that help new teammates or help the team in general feel more connected to one another. So let's pop back to this slide really quick. So, and I'll, when I send these slides, I won't give you this dramatic zoom in here, which is pretty fun. It's appropriate, given that this is called Embracing Humanity, that I would have a little bit of a GIF, a little bit of a snafu on one of the slides. So I'm just proving to you all that I'm a human being. So how do you set up this team agreement? Well, basically what you do is you get all of the teammates together, and you send this information out in advance before you have this huddle. And the questions that you want them to brainstorm about on their own are here. What kinds of information do we need to share as a team with each other? How will we communicate with each other? What response times do we expect out of one another? How will we know what's being worked on? Do we need to set core hours, or can we all work be done asynchronously? And how will we give each other feedback? These are just example questions to get started. And this team agreement idea is part of a bigger workshop that I teach called Work Together Anywhere, which dives into this a little bit more. But it's a very simple concept in that if you can provide these questions to your team in advance, have each of them brainstorm on their own, then bring the team together and have them share what they think is the best way to answer these questions, and tally these individual questions all together. If you're in a physical environment, you can put these on sticky notes, put this up on the wall. If you're in a digital environment, I would recommend using Trello. If you're familiar with Trello, you can actually create an entire board that only is for these team agreements and have each member create a card and place it within the board. So it's the same thing as writing on stickies, but it'd be a more digital sort of setup. And then from there, sort based on the trends that you're seeing and what are some of the responses that you're seeing more and more and more of. And rank those top answers from each of these questions and have the team narrow it down to maybe 2 or 3, and then have the team vote on those 2 or 3. This does not have to be a giant meeting. It doesn't have to take a full day. But what this does is this sets a precedent for what are these expectations that we have for each other that are outside of what our specific job roles are. I'll talk about this in the next slide, but the communication hierarchy is really, really important in that some people, if they use Slack, expect to get a response right away. If some people are big into email, they might expect an email response right away when they send something out. And if everyone has different expectations of what that is, there's going to be a lot of problems there. So another thing to consider with the team agreement when you're assembling this is, let me hop over to the next slide real quick. So it embraces agility, right? Because this agreement is a living entity. So decide upon when to review. So I would suggest making this team agreement, maybe take a couple hours to do this. Once the team agrees on what you're going to do, be agile about it and don't lock into this team agreement for a year. Do it for maybe a month and then have the team review, do a little retrospective on your team agreement, and then make some adjustments if need be and have the team vote again. This is a great way if you have somebody who's new to your organization to get, to feel more, how should I say this, to feel more connected to the culture of the organization, once again, outside of just what their role entails, and that's it. It creates clear expectations. Trust comes from knowing what's expected and delivering. And then commonality, there's no ambiguity here. Everyone knows how to improve the team. It's really frustrating when one person has a style of work that for some reason or another, you know, if somebody's blasting music in their office and it really fuels them and helps them to make great work, well, guess what? Probably the person next to them in the cubicle, unless they're also into that exact same kind of music, they're going to be distracted by that. And so I think when we look at frameworks and we look at how do we help improve the culture of an organization, we sometimes think a little too big picture. This helps us to really get a little bit more into the details and the nitty-gritties. And so we're not overlooking some of these small things that can turn into bigger issues with people becoming frustrated with one another. So once again, it gets everybody on the same page, which is crucial. And then a few other takeaways. Use this to foster emotional ownership. When the team creates the rules, they own the process, which is huge. This is not some mandate from a manager or from an executive that says, okay, this is what I need y'all to do. This is something that they're creating on their own. So they're going to take a lot of ownership in it. On top of that, it's going to build trust. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, it's a focal point for onboarding when you have new individuals joining the team. So let's talk about the communication breakdown, as I call it, not like a breakdown in communication, but breaking down communication. This is something that also might seem a little simplistic, but it's really, really important that you're very clear about how this is going to work within your team. And these are the 3 questions that I would ask amongst your teammates and make sure everybody's on the same page with this. So how do we chat immediately? If there's an emergency and someone needs to get a hold of you right away, or another teammate, how are you doing that? Is it a phone call? Is it a text? Is it an email with a high priority attached to it? There are a lot of different ways that we can all communicate, but we have to decide on which style of communication is the appropriate response for the level of urgency. The next is, how do we engage on a daily basis? For all of you who are using Agile, this is a great example of a daily stand-up. You know, what did you do yesterday? What are we doing today? What blockers exist in the way of us moving forward? This is really important to create a cadence. And then, how do we run our meetings? So being efficient about running meetings. Don't host meetings just for the sake of hosting meetings. It's all about being efficient. And there's nothing worse when you have a room full of people who are together and nobody's really quite sure why they're there to have this meeting. Having meetings for the sake of meetings is just something that's going to hold up the process of getting things done. So developing a cadence is really important. So I'm going to talk about proactive communication in the second section, but routine is also good for humans as well. You know, doing these daily stand-ups and having a similar time to do these daily stand-ups creates an expectation for accountability throughout the team. And the great thing with these daily stand-ups is you can do this in a remote setting, and it's very easy to do. But the biggest suggestion I would have for a daily stand-up, if you're going to have a lot of people in a physical room and then having remote workers also in these meetings, is you've got to make sure that your remote workers speak first. Too many meetings that I've been a part of as a remote employee, I have been watching the whole meeting happen, and then I'm asked at the very end of the meeting, oh, Drew, do you have anything you'd like to add to what we're talking about? And not only do I not feel engaged in the meeting because I've just been watching everyone talk for possibly an hour, but also I don't want to go into a lot of things that I want to talk about now because it's the very end of the meeting and you can feel that everyone's antsy and ready to go. So take that initiative and let your remote workers actually be the ones who speak first for these meetings, because you should be accommodating for them first. Be proactive, foster an environment where communication is open and honest, not just at moments where an individual needs something. If you get really, really good at saying thank you all of the time, even if it's for something very, very small, then if there's something small that needs to be improved, or if you have a small bit of constructive criticism, there's such a positive feedback loop regarding when things are going well that these little blips are not going to be a huge deal. But if you're only talking to people when they're doing something wrong, and we all know that person who only gets in touch with us, say that 3 times fast, when they need something, it's a really frustrating relationship to have. And that's definitely a lot more transactional than it's a transactional relationship instead of being a relationship built on trust, which is not good. And I'm going to mention this later. I can't harken this enough, but is there anything I can do to help? Ask that proactively. Don't wait until someone is clearly stressed, someone is clearly having difficulty with what they're trying to do. Just make it a typical, you can ask people. I love having meetings and not going into a meeting, especially a one-on-one with a preset agenda. I love going into meetings and asking the person a little bit about themselves. And the first thing I ask is, what can I do to help? And it just opens up the floodgates for how you can be a better leader. So section 2, let's talk about support. So what does your team need to improve on? So I'm going to skip this because we're running a little bit behind on time due to my epic slide that kept zooming in and out. But this section, we're going to be really talking about how do we provide support for the individuals within our remote teams. And what I mean by support is that security blanket, knowing that if our individuals that are working remotely need assistance, they need help right away, how do they get that? And how do they know that it's readily available to them? So supporting teams, this is one of many light bulb moments here. Supporting teams means supporting individuals first. You can't just, as a blanket expression, support the entire team. You have to focus on what each and every individual needs first to empower the team. So Chris mentioned this. I pulled this graph from Chris's webinar about tribes and understanding the different types of groups that form within your organization. And I won't go too much into this, but the reason I wanted to show this slide is it's really interesting to see how you all talked about alienation, or that when you're not around other individuals within your team, you don't feel connected, and therefore you're just not engaged to what's going on. So you can see at the bottom part of this graph, the alienated, hey, life sucks, nothing is good, the worst kind of tribe here, the very bottom of the barrel, so to speak, with low performing teams, they are not connected. And the same thing with also feeling separated, which stage 1 is everything is terrible, but stage 2 is my life is not great. So with a remote employee, I mean, this can happen at the same time, but if a remote employee feels like the morale at the physical office is really, really good and they're not being tapped into that, that can also be very detrimental to their psyche. So I show this because that emotional alienation is not just something that we say, well, hey, it's tough that people have to deal with not being in the same room as the rest of the team, but they'll figure it out. It really does impact the performance of remote workers when they don't feel connected to what's going on. So in the chat, I want you to write super quickly one small thing that annoyed you today, and one small thing that has brought joy to you today. And don't overthink it. And yes, there is a reason why I'm asking this question. Oh, Heather asks, is this work related? This can be work or personal life, whatever you'd like to share. I can tell you, and I'm working on this, I let traffic bother me too much. And maybe traffic isn't a little thing, but that's definitely a small thing that tends to bother me. So yeah, Jeff put red tape to get a project started. Teenage daughter. Pets tend to bring joy. They can also bring annoyance as well. Rainy day, but on vacation. There we go, a little staycation. People overthinking. I know that feeling. Okay, so why did I ask this? Well, you're looking at the slide here that talks about change management, and you might have heard this phrase before. But change management is the idea of how do we cope with something that is always going to eternally happen, which is change. And I was actually speaking with someone. I was hosting an entrepreneurial meetup this morning, and I was talking to someone afterwards, after the event. And we were talking about how we as an organization at Be Light think that change management is really about the individual, not so much the entire organization. Back to what I was saying at the beginning of this webinar. If you only think about an organization as a holistic entity and don't think about the individuals that make up the organization, you're going to miss how it's really helped people with the stress that comes with change, because every person is going with different, or every person is dealing with different kinds of stress due to changes that were unforeseen. Some are foreseen, but these four categories that you're looking at here are the main categories of what change management is from an organizational standpoint. So the first is organization. So I think we all understand what this means, right? Mergers, acquisitions, so the company getting bigger or smaller. As it says here, it's often focused on the people side of change. So a program is another style of change management. So change is to an ongoing portfolio of projects. So if you are working on something in the middle of a project and suddenly there's a U-turn, which hopefully within your Agile teams, of course, you wouldn't be trying to do this in the middle of a sprint, but still there are changes that always happen within projects and products that you're trying to deliver. Which leads me to the next kind of change management, which is project, right? So as I was saying earlier, projects often face constant change. And then departmental, how do we improve the success rate of changes and prioritize change to match available budget? So think of that as almost like, whereas the organizational up top is thinking about the organization as a whole, departmental is kind of breaking that down into teams, and how do we handle different, teams coming together or teams being split apart, so on and so forth. And I won't dive into this too much because we could have an entire webinar about change management and some strategies to help you out with this. But I bring this up because this is a very high level way of thinking about change management. But a lot of what eats away at us as individuals, whether we be remote employees or not, are the small changes that happen to us every day, or the small triggers that build up to something bigger. And so that's why I asked you all that question ahead of time, and it was saying, hey, what's a little thing that's bothered you today? What's a little thing that you enjoyed? It's really important that we as leaders allow for the individuals within our teams to be able to share some of these things that are bothering them, some of these smaller items, and just let that get out, so then it doesn't overtake the day, it doesn't set the tone for that individual's work that day, and therefore doesn't adversely affect what the team is trying to do as well. So a big part of supporting remote teams is you've got to be visual. We've got to see the work when it's happening. Chris and I are big fans of Trello because we have a small team. It allows us to see exactly where we are at with certain projects, and we can get updates very quickly instead of us having to have giant meetings to update each other about everything that's happening in general. We can just hop into a project that we know that's already started, and we can get updates, and we can provide our feedback or additional resources that we need to keep the project going. Micromanagement certainly still exists within remote teams. And I have seen remote employees quite often who feel micromanaged, although their managers are several states or countries away. And it's because there's just not that trust. There's not the trust that exists from managers or leaders to set the parameters for what's expected for success, or as we like to call the definition of done, and then to just get out of the way and let those people do the work. So setting realistic expectations, that can also be a primary source of misery for remote employees, and that because there's not a physical workplace that we go in and out of, there's a common misconception that remote employees are available at all times, at all hours of the day. And so if you're not sure how much work a remote employee can get done or how long it takes for a particular project to get done from their end, being visual is a huge way to allow for the entire team to see what's going on and get incorporated much more quickly. And then I think this is really important too, not just focusing on the project that you're working on in terms of being visual, but compare it to other projects and being able to zoom out a little bit more and see trends. I mean, this is why Kanban is such an important concept, in that it's supposed to allow you to see, when you're looking at the pool of work, what are those blockers and what are those things that are getting in the way? Where do you have these bottlenecks? And that can allow for the team to be more transparent and to find solutions more quickly. Okay, so I'm going to hop into Trello, and I'm going to share my Trello board with you real quick. We're going to do a really quick demonstration here. Quick question before I hop into this. If you could answer in the chat, how many of you have some type of appreciation board? And what I mean by appreciation board is, do you have a way for teammates to acknowledge something great that someone has done and to do it in a way that the entire organization or that the entire team can see? Okay, so it looks like a couple of you say you already have these appreciation boards, which is really, really great. So whether or not you have an appreciation board, I just want to show you, I'm going to get into Trello and take just 5 minutes, and I want to show you how to build a very, very quick appreciation board in Trello that you can easily access via a mobile device or a computer, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to share my Trello board. And of course, if you don't see something, please let me know in case there's an issue with technology. Okay, so you all should see my Trello board, and it has, 1 second here, it has the team hashtag Slinkythink at the top. So you all are team hashtag Slinkythink. Congratulations. So when you start with Trello, you can create teams, and then you create boards within teams. So I won't tell you how to organize this, but you could simply put the name of your organization here where the team is. Or if you just have a certain department you want to create this appreciation board for, just name that department. I would highly suggest letting the team name themselves. If you're going to have a board where people are going to interact with one another and share why they appreciate one another, let them take ownership in what the team is called, and you'll have some pretty funny results based on those teammates being pretty clever about how they self-describe one another. So pick a name and then go to create new board. So I'm just going to simply title this appreciation board. Now I'm an artistic fellow, so I always like to really dork out on, I'm going to expand this just a little bit. I like to dork out on picking a fancy background, so on and so forth, but I'm just going to keep these trees here for now, just for the sake of time. And this is where you can get really, really creative. So the functionality of this is very simple. So I would put different columns based on the timeliness of when people want to acknowledge each other for the great things that they've done. Now, this is just a suggestion. You could, if you had a team and you had different projects within the team, you could just set up these as different projects. So you could put project 1, project 2. So however you want to set up these columns and organize it, that's totally fine. The reason I do like this section here, where it's today, last week, last month, and the year, is that when you're adding these appreciation cards, just like you would with the Trello board, you can kind of move the cards over to the right. And so you get this fun little backlog, not a backlog, but you get this these done cards here of what you've completed here for the year. And so you can just kind of manually do a quick scan and look at these. If your board really gets filled up, you do want to clean up cards occasionally. So if this does fill up with a bunch of appreciation, I'm going to put, these are really generic. I'm just pulling names. So you get the idea. You can just create these separate cards. And as this starts to fill up, if you actually want to clear this out, you can just simply archive all the cards in the list, and you'll still have access to see those cards, but they're just not on the board itself. So they're just basically put into a folder. So if we start here with today, and I put, this is actually a perfect example, this card I made, of what not to do with an appreciation board. So we don't want to have generic ways to appreciate one another. We don't want to say, Don is great, or I think Deb is smart. That's not something that we, back to the how are you question, it is such a vague thing to say. It doesn't acknowledge a specific act of going above and beyond. So let's say, I'm just gonna pat myself in the back here to act like I meant to do this. So if you wanted to comment me and say, Drew made a slide that had crazy cool animation, oh boy. So start there and just place the card in today. Now, when you click on it, this is where this can get kind of fun. And I think there's a lot of creativity here that you can get into. You can have someone who put the card in actually add a description and talk a little bit more about what they did to help the team out. You could have other people write comments and say, hey, I saw that as well. That was super great. It can even be something as simple as just somebody putting an emoji and putting thumbs up. And that person's going to get feedback from the rest of the team for doing that. If you wanted to be able to see some sort of trending, not tasks, but trending moments that the whole team is really appreciative of, you can actually add a functionality called vote. So within Trello, you have these different power-ups here. I'm a big fan of the voting. This is really great for retrospectives if you want to use it. So I added this voting power-up here. And if all of you as the team wanted to vote and say, hey, this was really cool, we really like that slide he made, you could just come down here and vote. And now you can see that the card itself, you'll be able to see, it almost turns, I don't want to say it turns into social media because that's a loaded statement, but if there's something that the team acknowledges that was really above and beyond and was really great, people can vote and just say, yep, I saw that too. That's super awesome. And they don't have to put comments. They can just use the voting feature and that's it. So I would suggest at the end of the week to just kind of pull these over and to just start a new column here. And then, so really if you wanted to, probably to make this make a little more sense, add a this week, right? Because you have today, this week, last week. So you can just move these cards left to right. Once again, there's not a way that you have to organize this, but this is what's really important about, you don't have to use Trello. You could actually, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could do this, but because Trello is so easy to use on a phone or a computer, it's easy to pull up and get into this board and add your comment. We all have these moments where we go, oh, I really want to share with someone that they did something great, but then we run out of time, or we get distracted, we get a phone call, something else happens, and then we aren't able to share that. So it's really important to get your team into the habit of sharing these moments of appreciation as quickly as possible. And as a leader in your organization, or as a manager, whatever your role is, being part of the leadership, it's crucial that you are the person who starts this appreciation board and gets the culture wrapped around it. Because when people see that you as a leader are really appreciating everyone else in the team, it's only going to trickle down from there. And then the rest of the team is going to get involved and be really, really excited. So I'm actually going to share this board with all of you after the session. So if you want to get in there and play around with it, that's totally fine. And once again, Trello is totally free. So I will share that with you. So I hope this is very simple, but I hope it provides you a little bit of guidance of a very quick and easy way you could start an appreciation board. So I already went through Trello a little bit, so I'll just go ahead and skip that. And then lastly, because we're getting close on time here, I just want to talk about incentives. So this might not be news for a lot of you, but more money doesn't buy happiness with your employees. We aren't loyal to organizations. We are loyal to the people within organizations. I'm going to let this stew here for a second. I want you to think about this, because if you've ever thought, and I'm sure you've all been there, if you've ever thought about leaving an organization for an opportunity that you're really, really excited about, if there's ever this pit in your stomach, this feeling of, oh, I feel like I'm going to let people down, or if there's ever that little tinge of guilt, it's because of the people within your organization. You don't want to add stress to their lives. It doesn't. Sometimes people think that they're loyal to the whole group, to the entity of the organization. But as human beings, this is the core of what makes us human, is that we have to connect with other individuals. And so incentives quite often are tied into an organization and not to the individuals themselves, which I think is why there's such a disconnect when we say, oh, we're going to pay you more, and then people frankly don't like their job anymore, even though they're getting paid, because if they just don't like the work they're doing, money isn't really going to matter. So these are a few, I think, pretty poignant but creative strategies to help incentivize the employees that are part of remote teams. Once again, this can be a part of, you can adopt these for any team, whether it be physical in one space or a remote squad. Focus on the contributions that these people make outside of work. Are you fostering an environment where you support the team outside of work? Consider making a wall of appreciation. That we already covered, of course, but ask people, what are they doing to contribute to society that's outside of the 9 to 5, if you have those typical hours, workspace? Ask what altruistic activities do they participate in? As I mentioned earlier, I know that a lot of you prioritize your family now, just based on that one question I asked. And so that's very, very telling to get that sort of information out of the members of your team. Help your remote employees dream big. If you have a remote employee in a city or a country where you're not located, figure out what their motivations are in that place, and do they want to stay there? Maybe at some point they want to join the physical workspace, or are there aspects of where they live that are really important to them? Make sure you dive into that. This is huge from my experience with co-working, but spreading the word. Don't underestimate the ability for the individuals within remote teams to be ambassadors for an organization, because if they like what they do, and if they like working for the team, and they feel like they're connected, they are going to open up the door for your organization to be known to a lot of individuals who didn't know about you before. And they're going to know maybe a little bit more about what you do, but they're mostly going to know more about the fact that your culture is fantastic, and that this person is an extension of that fantastic culture. And then, as I mentioned before, change is inevitable. You just have to embrace it and be proactive about minimizing stress and anticipating needs. Fail fast. Once again, back to that team agreement, decide on something, do it quickly, see if it works. And if you want to adjust it, it's not a big deal. Being iterative is super, super important. Another light bulb moment. If you're not sure how to incentivize your team members, simply ask what they love doing. This also could be manifested in the question of, if you had half an hour to do anything that you wanted to do right now, what would you do? That's a great question, because then people say, oh, if I had time to do something, what would be my first priority? For me, it would be either playing some drums, working on some paradiddles or other rudiments, or it would be taking my 13-year-old Jack Russell Terrier named Ethel out on a walk. If I could do both those things at the same time, I would, but that's a challenging, well, I'm not going to even try. I just don't think it would happen, no matter how coordinated I am. Okay, since we're getting close on time, I just want to wrap up this session with a great quote from Susan David, who has a fantastic TED Talk. If you have not seen it, go to YouTube and search Susan David. And she talks about emotional accuracy and how important it is that we allow people to understand how they're feeling and to not be made to feel bad if they are angry or sad or happy or whatever that emotion may be. The quote, "People are not emotions. We feel emotions. We are a vessel for them." That is a really, really powerful quote. Jeff, because of your comments, Jeff isn't silly. I'm not going to say Jeff is silly just because he said a couple of comments that are really funny. Or, I don't know, Drew is sarcastic. If you just clump people in as a generalistic sort of term, then you're really shortchanging them and how complex they are as a human being. So really, really keep this in mind. If you're having a situation that's getting tense within your team, whether it be remote or not, just remember that people are vessels for emotions, and there's always some sort of quantifiable thing that's happening that is leading people to feel the way that they are. Do not make assumptions about the members of your team. Embrace empathy and always proactively ask how I can help. All right, so we are just about out of time for today. Does anyone have any questions for us? If you can throw that in the Q&A section. I'd also like to provide a super duper special thanks for all of you for being a part of today's session, because we had a record turnout for today's webinar. So I really, really appreciate that. This is the 6th edition of the hashtag Slinkythink sessions that we've hosted. And this has been a lot of fun. We've really enjoyed providing value for all of you. Moving forward, I'm going to be sending you all an email with the video replay of today's session. I'm also going to send you a link for the appreciation board via Trello. So if you want to play around with that, feel free. You can also just copy that board and create your own. So you can start there. But as you saw, it took me only just a couple of minutes to put together. It's very, very simple to do. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any takeaways you'd like to share, just put it on social media at VLifeLLC, hashtag Slinkythink. That would be much appreciated. You will be also getting an invite for the next session of the Slinkythink sessions, which will be in 2 weeks. As always, it's at noon on Wednesday, and it is free of charge. Lastly, I will do a little bit of shameless self-promotion in that I'm actually hosting an in-person workshop here in Indianapolis at the Speakeasy, which is a co-working facility that I work at. And we're going to have an interactive workshop talking about servant leadership in and out of remote teams, and how do we manifest the idea of servant leadership. So on behalf of VLife, I want to say thank you all for your time today. I will shoot you all an email in just a little bit with all those resources, as I mentioned. And I hope you gain some valuable tidbits from today's session. And I hope to see you in a couple of weeks. Until then, stay agile. We will talk to you soon. Cheers.